Hello there. Welcome to the Youth Issues Training module. My name is Luke, and I'm going to be doing the first half of the video presentations, and my coworker Ashley will, you'll meet her a little later on. So, some of you may be wondering, especially those who are training to be crisis line volunteers, why do I need to know how to talk to young people? Isn't there something called Connect Teen that young people can use to talk to fellow young people rather than adults? Well, yes, there is. So some of the people who are watching this may be training to be Connect Teen volunteers, and that's great. But there are a few reasons why everybody needs to know how to support young people. One of them is because sometimes we have parents talking about some of the struggles they're encountering with their kids and some of the things that their kids might be going through. Sometimes young people under the age of 18, call the general crisis line. Maybe they don't know about Connect Teen. Maybe they don't really see the need to talk to a peer per se. And outside of the hours that the volunteers Connect Teen volunteers come to operate the Connect Teen lines, Connect Teen phone calls are actually forwarded to the general crisis line, and crisis line volunteers are going to be taking Connect Teen contacts. So that is important to know. And the skills that we're going to discuss are just really useful for supporting anybody in general. But yeah, we'll give you a bit of context into what young people are going through, maybe give you some reminders into what it's like to be young, and some tips and ideas for how to support young people through youth-specific issues. So I'm going to begin by talking about Erik Erikson briefly. He is the fellow who put forth the models of psychosocial development. And one of the main things he suggested with regards to adolescent development is that during adolescence, an individual goes through an identity development that results in role confusion. And this role confusion, is largely the result of an individual differentiating themselves from their caregivers. So as somebody grows up, they become more autonomous, and they have to kind of develop their own sense of identity independent of their caregivers. So during adolescence, we have two major developmental changes that are going on. The first one, I'm sure you're familiar with, is puberty. So there's a surge of sex hormones, and there are changes in primary and secondary sex characteristics. The next thing that's going on is it's a neurodevelopmental process, and what's really happening. So here we have indicated that it's neuronal pruning, but what's really happening is the prefrontal cortex is going through some changes, and that is going to implicate some of the cognitions and perspectives and behaviors that we do when we're young. So we'll talk about that a bit. And while the cortex in general, specifically the frontal or prefrontal cortex, is under construction, the more primal parts of the brain that are already developed, specifically the limbic system, are going to have a bigger influence on behavior and cognition than our experience-dependent cortex. So if we look at this picture here, the center area is known as the limbic system. So this is developed by the time we're about 2 years old. So it's a fairly fundamental system that is used to experience emotions, to modulate and inhibit those emotions, and to generally regulate our arousal. The hippocampus here is the site of memory consolidation, and the amygdala right here is responsible for fear conditioned responses. So because of the limbic system, we can think of it as the emotional center of our brain. Because this is online by the time we're 2, we are going to have instincts that provide us the emotions necessary to guide our behavior towards survival instincts. So cry when we're hungry, we reach for our caregiver, whatever it may be. But our cortex here is it's an organ that is in need of experience-dependent growth, development, or plasticity. So we have a bunch of critical periods in it. There's a critical period for the occipital lobe. there's a critical period for our motor cortex, the top of our brain, and it kind of develops from the back to the front. And the critical period for our prefrontal cortex kind of begins in adolescence, early adolescence. And so what our prefrontal cortex really allows us to do is inhibit lower functioning systems like the limbic system. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the prefrontal cortex a bit more and executive function specifically and what those allow us to do. Now I want to start by mentioning, so the prefrontal cortex it starts development in early adolescence and it continues developing right until we're in our mid-20s. And I'm not suggesting that because the prefrontal cortex of adolescence is underdeveloped that they can never engage in executive forms of thought. I'm just trying to make the case that we know from a developmental perspective that there are certain systems that aren't in place. So we can't always expect that that young people act in ways that are akin to adults. Okay, so the term executive function is a complex concept, but I'm going to try and simplify it through describing the ability to delay gratification and suggesting that that is a really good example of executive functions. So if you think about what delaying gratification requires, we have to have an awareness of our present level of arousal or like emotional state. We have to, and this could be informed by some kind of desire, let's say. We have to be aware of a future-oriented goal, and we have to be able to inhibit whatever our present desire or urge is with the future goal in mind. Now, that's a pretty complex task, and it's something that we all take for granted. And when we're in crises, we might not necessarily be engaging in the best kind of executive thought. So just because I'm an adult doesn't mean I'm always practicing perfect executive tasks. But the implication of this for adolescents who are having to develop this, and because, again, it's experience-dependent development, there are a lot of mistakes that have to be made in order for the prefrontal cortex to be properly wired. So some of the other things that the prefrontal cortex or executive functions are responsible for, it's regulating our body. It is attuning our communication, so making sure we can match other emotional states. It's responsible for our ability to communicate empathy. It's able to modulate our fear. So if we have a limbic response, it's our prefrontal cortex, say it's our amygdala that's giving signals. Our prefrontal cortex can actually inhibit that. And so our amygdala, on the other hand, or our general limbic system, it is a little bit more primal, fight or flight. It's responsible for hyper arousal, so feeling really anxious or like energetic, or really depressed and hypo-aroused. And anything that's kind of centered around emotions. So what we're going to kind of talk about next is some of the ways that we can actually step in and act as surrogate prefrontal cortex for young people who are facing certain decisions, and even just in general for anybody who may be in crises.